So this morning, we have three people here from the Nelson A. Rockefeller Policy Research Workshop from Dartmouth College. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but basically the topic here is legislative approaches and policy on perfluorinated chemicals in water. And I will turn it over to the team.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ruben Gallardo, and I'm a senior at Dartmouth College.
My name is Josephine Yelowitzer. I'm also a senior at Dartmouth College.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Aquino, and I'm also a senior at Dartmouth College.
And we're going to be presenting the findings of our report on PFC regulations and drinking water standards in New Hampshire. So the methodology that we used for this report included reviewing peer review literature. So we looked at some of the potential adverse health effects, scientific papers on that of PFC chemicals. We also looked at the environmental impact of these chemicals. We followed that by looking at current regulations at the federal level, followed by a case study of states that have dealt with PFC contamination and their response to those instances. Finally, we looked at the New Hampshire regulations dealing with PFCs, and we concluded that with some policy options to take into consideration.
So as an introduction, what are PFCs? They're perfluorinated compounds. They are man-made out of carbon fluoride bonds, and they're specifically made to be resilient to natural degradation in the environment. They have a half-life of about 3.5 years, and they also include PFOAs and PFOS, which are perfluorooctanoic acid and perfluorooctane sulfate. Now, these bonds are found in a variety of household items. They're found in firefighting fluids. They're found in dish making soap, they're found in inks, and general coating of fabrics, metal, and plastics to prevent the crumbling of materials. So we've seen potential health effects that have been related to PFCs, and these include low birth weight, certain ties to thyroid cancers, elevated levels of cholesterol, and high blood pressure, a number of other health problems that we've seen. But there's been limited scientific research on specifically the causality of adverse health effects from PFCs, and this is due to a number of reasons. First of all, it's very difficult as currently for scientists to understand the disease mechanisms of how these chemicals specifically affect health effects in humans. Furthermore, we've seen that findings are limited due to extrapolation from animal studies, as it is more unethical to simply inject PFOAs in a human being and to see the effects of that. We've used rats and mouses and different animals to see the effects that come out of those specific studies. So here we see one example of an animal study that's been used, and specifically scientists have injected certain doses, milligrams per kilograms per day, in rat studies. At around 40 parts per billion is where we start seeing adverse health effects. These include low birth weight, decreased in pituitary size, decreased growth, and as the parts per billion numbers increase, we see worse health effects that come out of that. So decreased organ size and certain effects on the childbirth and the offspring of these rats. Now, the EPA has used many of these specific studies to make their recommended dosing levels for food and drink intake, which we now have a federal regulation of 70 parts per trillion. Furthermore, there's been environmental impacts of PFCs. There's a long range of transport of how these chemicals are brought into the environment. They are found from wastewater treatment plant runoff, through air stack emission, through firefighting activity, and thus it's been very difficult to really eliminate these compounds from the environment. Furthermore, we know that they are resistant to natural degradation in the environment, and they are not filtrated through traditional water systems. You need very specific water systems such as the GAC, granular activated carbon system, to really filter these compounds out of the drinking water.
So as you see here in this illustration, as Josie mentioned, there's a variety of ways that these chemicals are transported in the environment. This includes the disposal of wastewater that is contaminated with these chemicals, also through ambient air, and any type of solid waste that is stored in the soil that may contain these chemicals as well. As you can see on this graph, these different methods of transportation have a potential of affecting groundwater, given the fact that they might be deposited onto soil, and there's a possibility that that might seep into the groundwater. But as we mentioned, there's still not a lot of scientific understanding of how exactly they affect these different natural processes and how they make their way down there. So for communities that have been affected with PFC contamination, there's a variety of ways that they can treat their drinking water supply. This includes closing contaminated wells and blending water sources in order to dilute the amount of PFCs in the water supply. The standard method for filtration is a granular activated carbon system filtration filter that is used usually for community water systems in order to get rid of those chemicals and those chemical compounds in the drinking water supply. In addition to that, it is important to keep in mind that a lot of the times these methods are not readily available, and they require additional funding in order for community water systems to implement these into their community in order to filtrate the contaminated water. So some of the existing federal legislation that has been established was in 2016, the EPA established a lifetime health advisory level for PFOA and PFOS of 70 parts per trillion. This is a recommended guideline and it's not enforceable. It is more like a guideline for states to follow if there's a case where water samples show to have PFC levels that exceed this number. In addition to that, the federal government established a program in 2002 where they partnered with 8 major leading companies who use these chemicals, and they committed to reducing the emission of PFOA and PFOS by 95% by 2015. This program has reported to be successful. A lot of companies have reported these levels throughout the years, and they are working on phasing them out pretty much. So this is the federal existing recommended guidelines. So as you can see here, this is from a study that gathered data of reports of PFCs. As you can see, they're pretty widespread across the country. They're pretty much found anywhere, and they're usually concentrated in industrial areas. However, this is from a database that basically has been collected over the years, and it may include water samples that have exceeded the 70 parts per trillion recommended guideline, but it also includes other samples that just show detectable levels of PFCs that may be below that.
So as Ruben previously mentioned, one of our methodology was looking at different states and case studies to understand how both state and local governments and the industries involved reacted to the contaminants in the drinking water. So in 2016, New York was the first state to use emergency rulemaking to establish PFOAs as hazardous material. Thus, they used their legal ability to react to the various contaminant sites that they have found in New York. Governor Cuomo created 2 main initiatives. One of them was a water quality rapid response team. This really identified areas and about 250 facilities and private well near those facilities that have been found to have contaminants in the water. Furthermore, he created a $2 billion Clean Water Act, which specifically went on to expedite further investigations in the Gabreski Air Base and the Navy Northrop Grumman Plume Base. Furthermore, one of the contaminant sites in New York was Hoosick Falls. So for example, the Department of Health of New York provided free bottled water for the residents. Furthermore, they installed GAC carbon filtration systems for the residents, and they looked at different private wells and installed point of entry filtration systems, and the granular activated carbon systems really allowed for larger treatment and filtration of water systems that then provided the drinking water for the residents. Furthermore, Hoosick Falls was then added as a Superfund site under the EPA regulations, and the St. Gobain site that was near it.
So in Vermont, we saw something very similar in 2016. After the reports of PFC contamination in New York, the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation conducted some sampling in North Bennington near the former facility of ChemFab. Based on the findings, the samples showed concentrations that range from 40 to 2,880 parts per trillion. In response, they did some blood testing sampling of the community that was affected, and they gathered information on 477 adults and children, and they found that they had higher PFOA blood level concentration than the average US population. In addition to that, they established some emergency concentration levels for PFOA and PFOS of 20 parts per trillion, and later they established these permanently under current regulations in the state. Texas, although they have not had major occurrences of contamination that have been highly publicized, like New York and Vermont, in 2016, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality established protected concentration levels for 16 PFCs. This includes groundwater, surface water, and soil, all of these standards. And however, the protected concentrations level established by this entity are actually higher than the federal recommended levels. In addition to the way that they did this is they listed them under a current program called the Texas Risk Reduction Program, which is basically a standardized way of dealing with occurrences of contamination of chemicals that are listed under this program. It's a 3-tier program, which basically follows a 3-step solution where they have to establish that this site that has been contaminated qualifies for exclusion. If they do not, then they have to identify the pollution source, and that is followed by by deciding how they're gonna respond. It can either be removing the contaminant or choosing any other way of addressing the problem without having to remove the contaminant. And as you can see here, here are 4 out of the 16 PFCs that have a protective concentration level in Texas. As you can see, for PFOS, the protective concentration level is 560 parts per trillion compared to the 70 parts per trillion established by the federal government, and for PFOA it's 290 parts per trillion.
Additionally, we reviewed the state of Michigan, and here you see 14 different communities which have been affected by detectable levels of PFCs. And so what Michigan has done so far is that they established a 70 part per trillion level of enforceable guidelines for PFOAs and PFOS. So this was in 2018. Additionally, under Governor Rick Snyder, they created a PFAS risk response team. So what this team does is that it incorporates 10 different departments across the state, which include the Department of Environmental Quality and the Department of Health and Human Services, which then collaborate to create different health protocols as well as different community responses depending on the cases. And they also do public outreach to these communities to ensure that these communities are aware of different options that they may have and different issues that may arise due to this. So different cases in New Hampshire that we have looked at have resulted from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Service in 2017 released a report of 20 different investigation sites which they have identified as having detectable levels of PFCs. Out of these 20 different sites, over 222 samples collected out of the 1,600 samples were found to have detectable levels of PFCs above 70 parts per trillion. A few of these sites include areas such as the Peace Tradeport area. The Peace Tradeport area was initially found in 2014 to have levels that exceeded the provisional health advisory levels set by the EPA. And however, this program, the state already established a granular activated carbon system there to filtrate some of this water, and cleanup efforts have began. A different thing that has been established there is a blood testing program. So St. Gobain investigation area is also an area that has had detectable levels of PFC. This consists of the areas of Bedford, Lichford, Merrimack, Manchester, as well as Londonderry. And these areas were also found to have detectable levels of above 70 parts per trillion. Additionally, the Textile Coated International Investigation Area, which includes the city of Amherst, was also found to have levels exceeding the 70 parts per trillion. So, response to contamination. New Hampshire is pretty much on par with a lot of other states and what they have done to respond to contamination. This includes establishing a 70 part per trillion health advisory level as of 2016. This was a permanent level that was initially set up as an emergency rule, but in October it was established as permanent. And additionally, the state has created ambient air limits for APFO, and also has created a direct contact risk base oil concentration level for these 2 different types of PFCs. Different actions that have been taken on, aside from just the state, include a consent agreement which was reached by St. Gobain and different parts of the communities which were affected. Also, TSI has also agreed to help create a water extension project, which would then deliver municipal water to over 200 residencies, in addition to different residencies that are already being assisted by TCI. And additionally, the state also has a PFC investigation team, which is responsible for the research and identification of different areas which have been contaminated. And this team goes out and tests different wells depending on whether or not the residents request to, and whether or not the state also has identified the area as an area of concern. So this is also another part of an example of what New Hampshire has done. So they have collaborated, the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services has collaborated with the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services to create a blood testing program. So right here you can see that in southern New Hampshire, levels of PFOA in micrograms per liter in the concentration of blood of certain residents is higher than it is to the general population.
So based on all of this information, here are some policy options that may be taken into consideration. This includes expanding the scope of the PFC investigation team to follow something similar to what Michigan has done. They have taken a more multidisciplinary approach where they have health professionals and community outreach coordinators in their team in order to conduct this multidisciplinary efforts during the investigation phase of this response team. In addition to that, it might be necessary to communicate the findings that the team has found in order to inform legislation moving forward. The next thing is monitoring scientific findings to inform regulatory standards for PFCs in surface water, soil, and ambient air. As we previously mentioned, there's already some standards set for groundwater, soil, and ambient air here in New Hampshire. However, as more scientific data becomes available, it might be necessary to revise these since, as we mentioned, this is a very new and emerging contaminant, so there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding the recommended levels in order for humans to be at a safe level of consumption. In addition to that, another option would be to regularly update groundwater standard levels for PFCs. As we previously mentioned, New Hampshire has a 70 parts per trillion level set for PFOS and PFOA, but there's a variety of chemicals that are listed under that category. So it would be necessary moving forward to just keep monitoring that scientific data in order to keep going and make sure that we are addressing these potential contaminants. In addition to that, it's also important to keep in mind the health and economic trade-offs of implementing these regulations. As we mentioned, there's still a lot of uncertainty of what the long-term health effects are for humans that are exposed to these chemicals, and there's a lack of epidemiological data. So moving forward, it is important to keep in mind that there's still a lot of uncertainty, and there's still a lot of gaps in the knowledge of what is best for New Hampshire to implement. And lastly, as we previously mentioned, New Hampshire has clearly followed the same approach as other states, such as Vermont, New York, and Michigan. So the current regulations in New Hampshire are on par with the national approach. And right now, if you guys have any questions, we're happy to entertain any questions.
Struck by the fact that you didn't bother taking into account the C8 study in the Parkersburg, West Virginia area that resulted in a $1 billion plus settlement against DuPont and Chemours, the shadow company they set up to take the fall for this sort of stuff, as it's a national problem. As you'll recall, that's a 6-year study involving 65,000 people, and it came to rather specific conclusions as to what the damage, even over that short period of time, in something that's probably a chronic toxicity problem, like a lot of other chemicals like this, demonstrated, which wasn't reflected in your work. So what do you got to say about that? And then I got more.
Yes, so if you actually look at the report, we have another section included that's called Other States. Okay. And under that section, we talk about the C8 study in West Virginia. Right. And we also talked about other cases of contamination in Alabama. The only reason we did not include it in the presentation is because those two states currently do not have any sort of regulations. And that C8 study is basically one of the few epidemiological research studies that have been conducted, and they guide pretty much the recommended guideline established by the EPA, since it's one of the few findings that we have on humans and the health effects. However, it's just one instance, so if you look at the report where there's more information on there on that.
But it is the most extensive study, and it's real people, as opposed to the fact that you can't say that, for example, all your tests are on rats because it's unethical to infect people with this stuff or to expose people to this stuff. The finding of 20, or the recommendation that it go to 20, the requirement that it go to 20 in Vermont is largely a result of the fact that in Bennington they had a significant problem because St. Cobain had been there before they moved to New Hampshire. And of course, as I say, chronic toxicity is a huge part of it. The Vermont came to 20. I think New Jersey is now 14. Didn't hear you mention that. What is Pennsylvania? Are they going to 6, or have they not decided that
I
yet?
have not decided that.
Okay. In any event, there's a lot going on in this, and some of us, including me, feel that New Hampshire is well behind the curve and simply going along with whatever the federal government does and not taking into account the work that the other states are doing. And I'm finding very scant evidence that we've done anything other than say, oh yeah, it's out there.
In response to that, Vermont and New Jersey have been the ones that have set the lowest parts per trillion. New York is still working on that, and New Hampshire, although they're following the recommended guidelines,